Hi, I'm Raylan, 22, and tonight was supposed to be my graduation celebration. My dad and sister sat across from me, but what he said next turned the whole evening upside down. I never expected him to demand I give up the inheritance that was meant for me. It was shocking, unfair, and deeply personal. I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family drama, emotional courage, and standing your ground. The night was supposed to be perfect. I had imagined it countless times. My graduation cap neatly pressed, my parents beaming with pride, my sister smiling politely, and the entire family gathered to mark the end of years of late nights, group projects, and part-time jobs that had carried me through college. But reality, as it often does, refused to match the neat little picture I had painted in my head. We chose a small local restaurant for the dinner, the kind with warm yellow lighting, cushioned booths, and the faint smell of roasted garlic and caramelized onions that made my stomach growl even before I ordered. It wasn't fancy, but that was the point. I wanted something simple, something intimate, something that felt like home. My parents had been generous in their own ways, though generosity in my house always carried strings. Tonight, I had convinced myself it would just be about me. I arrived first, as usual, because I liked having a few minutes to breathe and mentally prepare. I checked my reflection in the glass of the restaurant door, smoothing down my shoulder-length brown hair, and adjusting the crisp blouse my grandmother had gifted me for the occasion. I wanted to look composed, proud, and mature. I wanted tonight to feel like a victory, not just over my coursework or academic struggles, but over the years of feeling invisible in my own family. The hostess guided me to our reserved booth, and I chose the side closest to the window. The soft hum of evening traffic outside contrasted with the quiet chatter inside, and for a moment I felt a rare sense of calm. I tried to push away the familiar tension that came whenever my father was involved in family events. He always had a way of turning small moments into subtle tests of loyalty or obedience. But tonight, I told myself, was different. Tonight was mine. Soon after, my sister, Marissa, arrived. She looked impeccable, as always. Hair perfectly styled, clothes carefully chosen, and that effortless confidence that seemed to turn every room into her stage. I smiled politely, trying not to let jealousy creep in. She waved at me, eyes flicking toward my mother before landing on my father. I caught that look, the mix of pride, and something I couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was expectation, maybe it was judgment, maybe it was something else entirely. My father came last, as he often did, holding a small, leather-bound notebook in one hand and scanning the room like he owned every inch of it. He always moved with a calculated confidence, a precision that made the air feel heavier than it should. When he finally sat down, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It never did. I tried to ignore it. Tonight was about me. I reminded myself, and no one's expressions would ruin it. The waitress approached, menus in hand, and we exchanged polite greetings. I felt the familiar flutter of nerves that always accompanied family dinners, a mix of anticipation and dread. The first course arrived, breadsticks and salad, and I let myself enjoy the simplicity of it. I took a small bite, savoring the crunch and the warmth of buttered bread. My father didn't say much, only nodding occasionally, while my sister twirled her fork in a practiced motion that suggested impatience or maybe boredom. I wasn't sure which. As we waited for our main courses, small talk filled the gaps. My mother tried to steer the conversation toward my achievements, asking about my thesis, my plans after graduation, and my part-time job that had helped me save for college. I smiled and answered politely, trying to keep the mood light, but I could feel my father's gaze shifting between me and Marissa. There was a weight there, unspoken, and it made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt before. Then it happened. Just as the waiter cleared the last of our salads, my father leaned forward slightly, his fingers drumming against the table. His voice was calm, deliberate, but every word hit me like a stone. "Raylan," he said, "we need to talk about the inheritance. I think it's time you gave it to your sister." For a moment, the room seemed to stop. My fork hovered midair. The salad on my plate seemed suddenly tasteless. My mother's fork froze, and even Marissa blinked in surprise, though she quickly masked it with a polite smile. I felt my heart thundering against my ribcage, a mix of shock, disbelief, and something deeper, betrayal. The inheritance wasn't a small matter. It wasn't a casual suggestion. It was mine. It had been carefully planned, my mother's intention clearly documented, yet here my father was expecting me to hand it over without question. I wanted to speak, to demand clarity, but my voice felt trapped. My mind raced, trying to piece together why he would say something like this at my graduation dinner. Why now? Why in front of everyone? My father had always had a way of asserting control, of testing loyalty, but this was different. This was public. This was humiliating. Marissa's reaction was subtle but telling. She didn't speak immediately. Her eyes flicked to my father, then back to me. There was a pause, a moment of suspended time, where every unspoken thought seemed to hang in the air. I realized then that she had expected this. Perhaps she had known it was coming, had rehearsed the polite way she would accept it, the look of relief she would display, once I obliged. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions rising inside me. My mother's hands clenched faintly in her lap, and I could sense her silent pleading. But I couldn't ignore the betrayal, not now, not ever. I had worked for every ounce of recognition, every dollar I had saved, every achievement I had earned on my own. To give it up, not because it was fair, but because my father demanded it, felt like erasing my entire journey. The waitress returned with our main courses, breaking the tension for a brief moment. The smell of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filled the air, but I couldn't focus. Each bite felt heavy, a reminder that life sometimes demanded more than celebration. It demanded confrontation, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. Not yet, anyway. As we ate in strained silence, small details stood out. The way my father's eyes never left mine, the slight curl of Marissa's lips, betraying satisfaction beneath the polite mask, the occasional glance from my mother, her concern and anxiety clear. Each moment added layers to the emotional weight, and I realized that tonight the celebration of my achievements had been eclipsed by something far more complicated. I tried to remember the happy moments of my college life, the late nights in the library, the friends who had become like family, the professors who had believed in me when my own family sometimes did not. Those memories were my anchor, my proof that my accomplishments were real, not merely the result of family privilege or obligation. But the anchor felt shaky, threatened by the very people who should have celebrated me most. In a small, almost imperceptible act of defiance, I reached for my water glass and sipped slowly, forcing myself to maintain composure. My father noticed, of course. He always notices. His gaze sharpened, and I felt the invisible weight of expectation pressing down on me. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a symbol of power, control, and the subtle hierarchy he had maintained in our family for decades. And now he was challenging me to surrender it willingly. The conversation didn't progress beyond that first shock. My father didn't explain further. Not yet. Marissa said nothing, not wanting to break the carefully constructed silence. My mother tried to steer the discussion back to my accomplishments, but the attempt fell flat. The air was thick with tension, heavier than any celebratory toast could lift. I found myself thinking back to simpler moments, my childhood birthday parties, the way my father had once praised me for small achievements, the way Marissa had always been the golden child. Those memories were tinted now, no longer purely joyful, but reminders of a family dynamic that had been quietly shaping me, testing my resilience, and setting the stage for tonight. As the meal continued, I noticed small interactions that revealed more than words ever could. My father's subtle nods to the waiter, my sister's barely perceptible smirk when she thought I wasn't looking, the way my mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. Each of these moments was a piece of the puzzle, a reflection of a night that was meant to celebrate me, but had instead become a crucible testing every ounce of my courage, patience, and self-respect. By the time dessert arrived, a simple chocolate cake with a single candle, the celebratory atmosphere had vanished entirely. The candle flickered in the low lighting, a fragile symbol of joy amidst the undercurrent of tension. I stared at it, realizing that tonight would not be remembered for the sweetness of chocolate or the sound of family toasts, but for the moment when my life shifted subtly yet irrevocably under the weight of my father's expectations. And in that flickering candlelight, I understood something important. This was my night, even if no one else recognized it yet. I had a choice. I could allow the moment to break me, to bend to demands that weren't fair. Or I could quietly, steadfastly choose myself. The night meant to celebrate me had already turned into a test of loyalty, courage, and self-respect. But even in the midst of tension, I felt the first sparks of clarity. I would not give up what was mine, not quietly, not politely, not ever. The room seemed to constrict all at once, the warm glow of the overhead lights now feeling harsh, almost accusing. My father's words, calm yet unwavering, had punctured the air like a sharp note in a silent room. "Raylan, it's time you gave the inheritance to your sister." The words didn't just land. They lingered, echoing off the walls, off every polished surface, and somehow inside my chest, I could hear the faint clinking of silverware, the soft shuffle of my mother's hand as she reached for her glass, her knuckles whitening under the pressure. Time slowed, though I barely noticed the seconds stretching. I felt the invisible weight of the table pressing down on me, the polished wood somehow acting like a cage. My stomach tightened, my heartbeat loud and uneven in my ears, each thump a countdown to the confrontation I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the inheritance anymore. It was the realization that my father had planned this, that the celebration I had been waiting for had transformed into a trial. I could feel Marissa's gaze on me, that quiet, unyielding stare she always wielded with precision. She didn't say a word, but I sensed the silent approval she expected, the unspoken message that compliance was the easiest path. I wanted to scream, to tell her, and my father, that I had earned this, that I had worked and struggled and sacrificed for years without asking anyone to pay for it. But my voice seemed to have evaporated in the thick air of that booth, leaving only a trembling thought. How could he do this to me here, now? My father, as usual, remained composed, almost unnervingly so. His hands rested neatly on the table, fingers interlaced, and there was a faint tension in the way his shoulders held themselves, controlled, deliberate. He didn't raise his voice. There was no yelling, no dramatic flair, just the cold precision of expectation. "It's only fair," he added, his tone deceptively soft. "Your sister needs it more than you do." The words hit harder than any shout could have. "Needs it more than I do." I thought, my mind racing. I could feel my chest tightening, my palms damp against the smooth wood of the table. I wanted to ask why, but the words would have seemed weak, a desperate attempt to cling to something that was mine. And yet the question demanded an answer, one I wasn't sure I would ever receive. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. I noticed the faint sounds around the room, the low hum of the air conditioner, the occasional clatter from the kitchen, but everything felt distant, muted by the intensity at our table. Even the waiter, who had been hovering politely nearby, seemed to sense the shift, backing off with cautious steps, leaving us in a bubble of tension that had been carved from my worst fears. I tried to focus on my own reactions, to ground myself in the physical reality rather than the emotional upheaval. My hands gripped the edges of the table, nails digging into the wood just enough to remind me I was here, present, and capable of action. I forced myself to look at my father directly, noting every detail: the slight crease at the corner of his mouth, the narrowed eyes, the faint tension in his jaw. He was expecting a response, and yet I didn't know if I was ready to give him one. Marissa's subtle movements betrayed more than her words ever could. She leaned slightly forward, resting her chin on her knuckles, eyes sharp, calculating. I could feel her measuring me, judging my reaction, gauging the extent to which I would bend under pressure. There was no malice in her expression, not exactly, but a cold practicality that made my blood run cold. She wasn't asking, she was waiting, silently, for me to yield. I felt my mother shift in her seat beside me, a small but noticeable movement that carried a weight of expectation. She tried to catch my eye, her expression pleading, almost apologetic, as if she bore some of the responsibility for what was unfolding. But her quiet anxiety only added to the complexity of the moment. My family, all three of them, was here not just physically, but as forces acting upon me, each pulling in a different direction, each silently demanding a choice I hadn't anticipated having to make tonight. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, feeling the tension coil tighter in my chest. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was my mother's legacy, her careful planning, her belief in me when my father's pride had often favored my sister. To give it up would be to erase years of struggle and achievement, a literal and symbolic surrender. My father's calm insistence made it feel like a test I was failing simply by existing. As I tried to collect my thoughts, fragments of past experiences surfaced, moments when I had been overlooked, passed over for praise, the times my accomplishments had been minimized in favor of Marissa's more visible successes. She was always the one who got the attention, the acknowledgement, the compliments. I had learned early to remain in the background, to avoid conflict, to stay small. But tonight, something inside me refused to shrink any further. The waiter approached cautiously, setting down our desserts, a modest chocolate tart for me, a cheesecake for Marissa. The clinking of plates against the table broke the tension slightly, yet the underlying strain remained palpable. I mechanically lifted my fork, taking a bite, but the sweetness felt hollow, drowned out by the storm of emotions raging beneath my calm exterior. My father watched me carefully, as if testing how long I would take before responding. "Raylan," he began again, slower this time. "I don't want you to see this as punishment. Your sister just needs this. She's had a rough time lately, and you've done well for yourself. I think it's only right." Only right. Those words stung with deliberate cruelty, a mask of reason covering an act that felt inherently unfair. I wanted to respond, to argue, but the words seemed inadequate. Nothing I could say would undo the public pressure, the quiet expectations, the sense of obligation that my father had woven around this single moment. I felt my own hands tremble slightly, a rare physical reaction that betrayed the storm inside. I could feel the heat rising in my face, the pulse in my temples, the slight clench of my jaw as I struggled to maintain composure. Marissa shifted in her seat, a subtle sigh escaping her lips, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She was ready, waiting for me to break, to give in, to hand over what was mine without resistance. The room seemed to grow smaller with each passing second, every movement magnified. I noticed the gentle sway of the hanging light above us, the faint reflection of my own face in the polished wood of the table, the soft scrape of a chair as a nearby couple left the restaurant. Every detail became amplified, as if the world outside had faded, leaving only the pressure cooker that was this table. I tried to imagine a different response, a way to navigate this without confrontation. Perhaps a polite nod, a carefully worded excuse, a moment of hesitation that would satisfy my father while preserving my integrity. But even as I considered it, I realized it was impossible. To comply, even momentarily, would betray everything I had worked for, everything my mother had intended for me. Marissa's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, and I felt a surge of anger that was both frightening and clarifying. She hadn't needed to say a word. Her presence, her expectation, was enough to make the moment unbearable. And yet, within that anger, a clarity began to form. I understood that this confrontation was not just about money, inheritance, or even parental control. It was about identity, about claiming my place in a family that had long defined itself by favoritism and hierarchy. I shifted slightly in my seat, trying to make my thoughts tangible, to turn them into words that would assert my presence without sparking the ire I knew lay beneath my father's calm exterior. "Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I don't think that's fair. The inheritance was always meant for me. I can't just hand it over." The words were small, but carried weight. I felt a subtle change at the table, the faint stiffening of my father's posture, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the quick glance Marissa gave him, almost seeking guidance or approval. The tension didn't dissipate, but it shifted, now layered with a new element: resistance. I had spoken, and in doing so, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming control of the night, even if the outcome remained uncertain. The silence that followed was electric, charged with unspoken thoughts, judgments, and calculations. My father opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it, his fingers drumming against the table lightly, a staccato that mirrored the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Marissa's lips pressed together, eyes darting between us, and I could sense the internal debate she carried: relief that I had at least voiced a response, confusion at how I could refuse, curiosity about what would happen next. My mother exhaled, quietly, almost imperceptibly, a mixture of relief and anxiety. I caught her hand, giving it a subtle squeeze, as if to acknowledge the precariousness of the moment. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the simple act of refusing was a monumental decision, one that carried emotional reverberations far beyond this restaurant booth. The dessert, once a neutral comfort, now felt like a backdrop to the emotional tension. Each bite was deliberate, almost defiant. I tasted the chocolate tart fully for the first time, letting its sweetness remind me that small pleasures could coexist with conflict, that I could exist as my own person, separate from the expectations and demands of those around me. As we lingered at the table, the pressure didn't abate. It evolved. Conversations around us faded into a blur. My father's attempts to rationalize, Marissa's quiet approval, my mother's silent encouragement, and my own internal reckoning all merged into a singular awareness. This night had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer just the dutiful daughter at a graduation dinner. I was a young woman asserting her agency in a family that had long assumed she would comply. Every small movement, glance, and sigh contributed to the narrative being written silently at that table. Each of us played our part, intentionally or not, in a drama that unfolded without script but carried weight far heavier than any celebration could have provided. I realized in that quiet intensity that the night had already transformed. My father had made his move, but I had begun mine. Even as the restaurant's gentle hum continued around us, I felt the table itself become a stage. The inheritance demand was no longer merely words. It was a test of courage, patience, and self-respect. And I understood that my response, measured and deliberate, would define not just the evening, but the trajectory of my place within my family. The dessert plates were cleared eventually, the candle flickering one last time before the waitress returned to collect it. But the glow remained in my mind, the glow of realization, the glow of clarity, the glow of the first act of defiance in what I knew would be a long, emotionally complex night. The table had turned against me, yes, but in turning, it had revealed the truth. I had a voice, and I could use it. The weight of my refusal lingered in the air long after the last forkful of dessert had disappeared. It wasn't just a simple no. It had become a tremor moving quietly through the room, invisible yet palpable. Every glance, every subtle movement carried a quiet accusation, a reminder that I had stepped out of the invisible lines that had been drawn around me my entire life. My father's expression, calm yet unreadable moments ago, had hardened ever so slightly, and I could feel the first pulse of tension radiating outward like ripples in still water. He leaned back in his chair, fingers still pressed against the polished table, eyes narrowing just enough to hint at displeasure. There was no shouting, no dramatic gesture, just a quiet, simmering intensity that made my stomach knot tighter. It was a pressure that pressed not only on my chest, but into my very core, as though my refusal had shifted the gravity in the room, forcing everyone to adjust. I realized then that his method of control was subtle, slow, and almost surgical. The words were just the first step. The real pressure was what came after. Marissa shifted slightly, her body language speaking louder than any words could. She didn't say anything immediately, but the faint curl of her lips, the slight lift of her eyebrows, suggested satisfaction mixed with anticipation. She had expected me to comply, to yield gracefully, but I had dared to challenge the script she had internalized. It was clear she was calculating, weighing my reaction, trying to anticipate how far I would go, and what it would cost me. I could feel the scrutiny of her gaze as acutely as my own heartbeat, and it added a layer of suffocating tension. My mother, sitting quietly beside me, tried to interject softly, a delicate attempt to soothe the situation. "Raylan, maybe," she began, her voice tentative, almost fearful. But even her gentle approach only heightened the sense of pressure. Her words, meant to guide and calm, carried a weight of expectation, an implicit message that I should reconsider, that perhaps compliance was the easiest path to preserve peace. And yet, her eyes betrayed a mix of guilt and worry, as though she silently acknowledged the injustice of the moment, while still hoping I might make a different choice. I felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, anger, frustration, anxiety, but also clarity. The pressure wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about the family's carefully maintained hierarchy, the invisible power dynamics that had governed my life. My father had always tested boundaries in subtle ways, but now it was unmistakable. The test had escalated, and the weight of his expectations was pressing directly down on me. The waiter returned at that moment, subtly glancing at the tension that had taken root at our booth. He offered polite smiles, refilled water glasses, and backed away, as if sensing the unspoken conflict without ever needing to understand it fully. The small, ordinary movements of a restaurant, napkins being folded, dishes being cleared, the clatter of silverware, suddenly felt amplified, each sound punctuating the silent standoff between me and the family I had once trusted implicitly. I looked around the table, taking in the intricate web of pressure. My father's calm intensity, my sister's quiet calculation, my mother's anxious intervention, all of it combined into a tangible force field, one that threatened to envelop me completely. I realized then that every choice I made in the next moments would ripple outward, altering not only the dinner but the family dynamic I had long accepted. The realization made my chest tighten, yet it also ignited a spark of resolve. I tried to anchor myself in the physicality of the situation to make the abstract pressure concrete. I noted the way my father's fingers flexed on the table, the slight tap of his foot against the floor, the way his gaze shifted from me to Marissa and back. Each gesture carried meaning, each subtle motion a reminder that this was a carefully constructed challenge. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her napkin across the tablecloth, a gesture of calm she clearly did not feel. And Marissa leaned in just enough to suggest interest, her movements precise, rehearsed, predatory even without a hint of open hostility. The silence stretched, each second magnifying the tension. I felt a bead of sweat slide down the side of my neck, and I brushed it away discreetly, not wanting to reveal the physical toll of the pressure. I realized then that this confrontation was about more than just words. It was a psychological test, a subtle war of wills, and I was very much in the center of it. I recalled other moments in my life when subtle pressure had been applied, teachers who praised Marissa more readily, family members who offered compliments strategically, choices that always seemed to favor someone else. Those experiences had been small, almost imperceptible, but tonight they had all converged, magnified by the immediacy of the inheritance demand and the public nature of the confrontation. It was a culmination of years of expectation and quiet control, and I was now fully aware of the stakes. My father finally spoke again, his tone measured, almost clinical. "Raylan, this isn't about punishment. You've done well. You've achieved a lot. But your sister, she's had difficulties that you might not fully appreciate. Family comes first, and it's only fair that she receives the support she needs." Each word landed with precision, a combination of praise and pressure that made it impossible to respond impulsively. I felt a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface, not at the inheritance itself, but at the method, at the timing, at the calculated way this demand had been presented. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a performance, a deliberate attempt to make me crumble under scrutiny. Marissa shifted, brushing her hand lightly against the table, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. She didn't speak, but her presence alone added to the pressure. I could feel her silently testing me, measuring my reaction, perhaps even expecting a subtle tremor, a hesitation, or a faltering gaze that would indicate compliance. And yet, the anger and determination inside me had hardened into a quiet, unshakable resolve. I would not give in, not in this moment, not under this carefully orchestrated scrutiny. The waiter approached again, placing our coffee cups in front of us. The sound of the ceramic touching the table was deafening in the silence. I sipped my coffee, using the warmth as a small anchor to steady myself. The aroma, rich and comforting, reminded me of ordinary mornings at home where control and expectation were less pronounced. For a fleeting moment, the small comfort of the coffee contrasted sharply with the emotional tempest surrounding me. My mother, sensing the shift in my posture, attempted another intervention. "Raylan, maybe you could." She started softly, her voice almost a whisper. Before pausing, I caught the hesitation, the internal struggle between wanting to support me and succumbing to her husband's control. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in that instant, I felt a surge of gratitude and sorrow all at once. She understood the difficulty of the choice before me, yet she was constrained by the same invisible pressures that held the table captive. The air felt heavier now, saturated with unspoken judgments. Every subtle gesture, every glance, every movement had weight. I noticed the way my father's lips pressed together as if counting unspoken calculations, the way Marissa's foot tapped lightly under the table in rhythm with my growing tension, the way my mother's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, betraying worry she tried to mask. I felt like I was under a microscope, every reaction scrutinized, every thought weighed. I reflected on the broader implications of this moment. This wasn't simply a family dispute or a discussion about inheritance. It was a test of resilience, a crucible designed to see if I would bend, yield, or disappear under pressure. And for the first time in years, I understood the magnitude of my position. I was no longer merely the obedient daughter. I was a young woman standing on the precipice of autonomy, and the choices I made tonight would shape my identity in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend. As the minutes passed, I became acutely aware of the physical effects of the sustained tension. My muscles tightened, my jaw ached from the effort of holding back words that demanded to be spoken. My chest felt constricted, as if the air itself were a tangible force pressing down on me. Even so, within this pressure, I felt a growing clarity, a recognition that I could endure this, that I could navigate it, that I had the right to assert myself despite the carefully constructed expectations surrounding me. Marissa finally spoke, her voice soft but deliberate, a quiet test in itself. "Raylan, it's not personal," she said, though every inflection suggested the opposite. Her words were calculated, almost rehearsed, as if she had anticipated this moment for years. I noted the subtle attempt at neutrality, and yet it only reinforced the sense that I was being evaluated, measured against a standard that had long been invisible, yet always present. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the physicality of the situation, the smooth wood of the table beneath my palms, the gentle warmth of the coffee in my hands, the hum of the restaurant around us. I realized that the pressure would not ease until I chose my response, until I asserted my stance, and that the act of standing firm was not only necessary but liberating. I finally met my father's gaze directly, letting the weight of the moment settle into the space between us. "I understand what you're saying," I said quietly but firmly, "but I can't just give it away. This inheritance was meant for me, and I need to honor that." The room fell into a tense silence, once more heavier than before. My words had shifted the dynamics, subtly establishing a boundary that could not be ignored. My father's fingers stilled on the table, Marissa's eyes widened fractionally, and my mother's lips parted as if to say something, then closed again. I felt the pressure evolve. It hadn't disappeared, but it had changed form. Every glance, every movement now carried a new meaning. The pressure was no longer purely oppressive. It had become a reflection of the consequences of choice, of standing firm, and of asserting agency within the family structure. I realized with a strange mixture of relief and trepidation that the night had transformed into something more profound than celebration or conflict. It had become a defining moment of self-realization. The air between us had grown almost unbearable, thick with unspoken expectations, quiet judgments, and the unrelenting pressure of my father's insistence. I could feel every heartbeat in my chest, each one pounding louder than the last, as I realized that this moment, this single, fragile instant, was mine to claim. The quiet hum of the restaurant faded into a dull blur, the conversations from nearby tables nothing more than distant echoes. I was hyper-aware of the space around me, the table beneath my hands, the faint scent of Marissa's perfume, and the weight of my father's eyes pinned on me like a spotlight I could not escape. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself to steady the tremor in my hands. My coffee sat untouched, the warmth radiating faintly against the cool of the ceramic cup, but I barely noticed it. My gaze drifted briefly to Marissa, who leaned forward just enough to suggest interest, her chin resting on her palm, her expression carefully neutral yet undeniably expectant. Every small movement she made was deliberate, calculated, an unspoken test of my patience and resolve. I realized then that this wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about control, hierarchy, and obedience, and I had just refused to play by their rules. I finally lifted my gaze to my father. He leaned back slightly, his hands folded neatly on the table, a mask of calm etched across his face. But I could see the subtle tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible clench of his jaw. His calmness was deliberate, a tool wielded to unsettle me, to make me doubt the strength of my decision. And yet, the more I studied him, the more I understood something crucial. His power was only as strong as my compliance. Tonight, I had refused. Tonight, that power was unsteady. The first words escaped my lips before I could second-guess them. "I can't do it," I said, quietly, deliberately measured. The sound of my own voice startled me slightly, as if I had been holding it prisoner for years, and the act of releasing it felt almost like breathing underwater for the first time. "I can't give up something that was meant for me. I earned it. It's mine." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and almost sacred. My words had landed like stones on a calm lake, and the ripples spread through the family around me in ways I could feel, but not yet see. Marissa's lips parted, perhaps to speak, perhaps to challenge me, but nothing came out. My mother's hand twitched near mine, unsure whether to offer support or intervene. And my father remained still, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking, as if weighing my soul itself. For a long moment, no one spoke. The world outside our table continued, oblivious, the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the low hum of conversation from other patrons. But inside the bubble we occupied, time had stretched and warped. Every second was pregnant with tension, every movement magnified, every breath deliberate. I felt the quiet pressure of expectation pressing against me from all sides, but beneath it, a new sensation began to grow: clarity. I realized something important in that instant. My refusal, quiet and deliberate, was more powerful than any shouting, any dramatic confrontation could have been. It didn't need to be loud to resonate. It didn't require spectacle to assert itself. The simple act of standing firm, of choosing myself over the carefully orchestrated demands of my family, carried a gravity all its own. And in that clarity, I found a strange, almost liberating courage. Marissa finally broke the silence, her voice low and deceptively casual. "Raylan, it doesn't have to be like this," she said almost gently, but even in the softness, there was a tension that betrayed her intent. She wasn't pleading. She was testing, seeking a crack in my resolve that might allow her to claim what she felt entitled to. I noticed the faint flicker of a smile at the corner of her lips, a predator recognizing hesitation, and it only strengthened my resolve. I met her gaze steadily, letting the silence speak for me more than words ever could. "It is like this," I replied softly but firmly, "because it's my choice, and this was always meant to be mine. I can't give it up just because it's convenient for anyone else." The words felt solid as they left me, a quiet affirmation that anchored me in the center of the storm that had enveloped our table. My mother shifted in her seat, her expression a mixture of worry, relief, and admiration. She didn't speak immediately, but the subtle tightening of her hand as she rested it lightly on the edge of the table told me everything I needed to know. She understood, in a way she hadn't been able to articulate before, that my quiet refusal was an act of courage, and that it would reverberate far beyond this dinner. My father's reaction was slower, more deliberate. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, eyes narrowing as if he were attempting to decipher a puzzle that had suddenly grown impossibly complex. "Raylan," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge, "I didn't expect this. You've never," he paused, glancing at Marissa, then back at me, "you've never refused like this before." And he was right. I had followed rules, stayed quiet, and avoided confrontation for most of my life. But this night had demanded something different, something more. I wasn't just asserting a point. I was defining myself in a way that had previously been denied to me. I realized then that the quiet nature of my refusal made it sharper, more disarming, and more difficult to counter. It was a refusal that required no explanation beyond its existence. It simply was, and that alone carried power. Marissa's eyes widened fractionally at my father's words, a silent acknowledgement that she hadn't anticipated my strength. Her mouth opened slightly, perhaps to argue, perhaps to cajole, but she hesitated. I could feel the tension building in her, the unspoken calculation as she reconsidered how to navigate this sudden shift in dynamics. For the first time, I could see cracks in the carefully constructed expectation she had brought to the table. My mother exhaled quietly, the sound almost imperceptible, but enough to convey relief. She had long worried about the way my father and sister dominated these family moments, and now, subtly, she recognized a shift. The quiet refusal, though gentle in delivery, had altered the balance. It had created space where there had been none before. I noticed the restaurant's subtle reactions as well. The waiter paused briefly as he passed by, eyes flicking toward our table, as if sensing the intensity that radiated from us. A couple at a nearby table glanced over, curiosity evident in their expressions, though unaware of the specifics. Even the ambient noises, the soft clatter of dishes, the low hum of voices, seemed muted against the gravity of the standoff at our booth. I felt a wave of calm wash over me, paradoxically, as the pressure shifted. It was no longer an oppressive force meant to coerce. It had become a mirror reflecting the consequences of choice, the quiet power of assertion, and the first step toward reclaiming my autonomy. Every subtle glance from my father, every twitch in Marissa's lips, every silent nod from my mother was part of a narrative that I was now actively shaping. Then, unexpectedly, my father's expression softened just slightly. It wasn't approval, not exactly, but a grudging acknowledgement of my resolve. "You're stronger than I thought," he said, the words carrying a complex mixture of pride, frustration, and perhaps even respect. It struck me as an odd compliment, the kind that leaves a lingering weight rather than comfort, but it was significant. It was the first acknowledgement that my refusal, quiet as it was, had altered the dynamic irreversibly. Marissa, sensing the change, shifted in her seat again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should talk about this later," she said, though the hesitation in her tone betrayed uncertainty. It was the first moment she hadn't been entirely sure of herself, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from victory, but from the recognition that standing firm had introduced a new reality to the conversation. My mother reached over, lightly brushing my hand with hers, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. She didn't need to say anything. The touch communicated support, acknowledgement, and shared understanding. It reminded me that even in the most controlled, pressurized moments, silent affirmation can carry more weight than words ever could. I leaned back slightly, taking a moment to center myself, letting the quiet of my refusal settle into the room. The pressure that had been nearly suffocating had not disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer a force meant to coerce. It was a testament to endurance, patience, and the subtle power of standing one's ground. The quiet refusal had changed everything, not just the trajectory of the evening, but the underlying currents of expectation, authority, and control that had governed our interactions for years. Every small detail, the soft flicker of candlelight, the gentle clink of a silver spoon, the muted hum of conversation around us, became part of the atmosphere, part of the canvas upon which this pivotal moment had been painted. I felt a quiet confidence rising, a recognition that asserting oneself does not always require loud declaration, but can be most profound in its understated clarity. The night had already shifted irreversibly. My quiet refusal had not just preserved what was mine. It had redefined the narrative of the family dynamic, establishing a boundary that had previously been invisible. The tension remained, yes, but it was tempered now by acknowledgement, by the understanding that my voice mattered, and that my autonomy could no longer be ignored. And in that quiet, steady moment, I understood the true weight of choice, the subtle power of presence, and the enduring impact of refusing silently yet resolutely. The inheritance, the words, the stares, the pressure, they had all converged to create a crucible that tested me, reshaped me, and ultimately reminded me that strength is not always loud, but it is always undeniable. I pushed back from the table slowly, the subtle weight of the night pressing against me in every direction. The quiet refusal I had clung to for hours had not only defined the evening, it had reshaped my understanding of myself, my boundaries, and the dynamics that had long governed my family. For a moment, I simply sat there, letting the gravity of the decision settle, feeling the pulse of my own heartbeat as a reminder that I was still very much alive and very much in control of my choices. My father's gaze lingered on me, a mixture of frustration and something unrecognizable, perhaps reluctant acknowledgement. The quiet authority he had exerted all my life now seemed challenged, like the surface of a pond disrupted by a single stone. I could see the calculations behind his eyes, the internal debate as he tried to reconcile his expectations with the reality of my defiance. It wasn't anger in the explosive sense. It was the slow, simmering tension of someone grappling with the unexpected, a tension that reminded me of the delicate balance I had maintained throughout my life. Marissa shifted in her seat, the slightest flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. She had been so confident, so poised, expecting me to fold, and yet here I was, calm, composed, resolute. I noticed the small things, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the table, the subtle arch of her brow, the faint hesitation in her breathing. Even without words, the impact of my decision was visible. For the first time, I realized that my quiet, deliberate refusal had consequences far beyond what I had anticipated. It had altered not just the course of this night, but the expectations she had carried with her all these years. My mother's hand found mine again, resting lightly atop it, a gesture both grounding and affirming. I could feel the warmth of her palm through the thin fabric of my sleeve, the steady pressure a reminder that support could be silent yet profound. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes conveyed gratitude, relief, and a recognition of the strength I had displayed. That moment of connection, subtle yet powerful, reminded me that life could be lived with integrity even in the presence of conflict and familial expectation. As the restaurant's lights cast a soft glow across our table, I realized that the celebration we had started the evening with, my graduation, my achievements, had transformed into a crucible of character, and I had emerged, not broken, but strengthened. The quiet refusal, the act of standing firm without raising my voice or succumbing to pressure, had defined the trajectory of the night. It was a small victory, perhaps invisible to the casual observer, but monumental in its implications. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress as I did, feeling the subtle shift of muscles I hadn't realized were tense. Every movement carried intention, a conscious reclaiming of space that had often felt denied. The chairs scraped softly against the floor as I prepared to leave, and I felt the weight of expectation shift, subtly but unmistakably. I was walking away not just from the table, but from a pattern of compliance that had dictated my life far longer than I had recognized. My father's voice cut softly across the space as I gathered my belongings. "Raylan," he said, carefully measured, "I suppose we'll discuss this later." The words were layered, a mixture of resignation and calculation, and I caught the slight hesitation in his tone. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. But in those few syllables, I could feel the ripple effect of the evening settling into the foundations of our family dynamic. For the first time, I understood that standing firm could shift long-established patterns, even if subtly, even if slowly. Marissa's lips pressed together, a faint flush creeping up her cheeks. She didn't speak, and in that silence, I recognized the acknowledgement of change. My quiet refusal had disrupted the rhythm she had expected, and while she may not have admitted it openly, she had felt the shift. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably present. I sensed a recalibration of her understanding, a recognition that the assumptions she had carried about my compliance, my passivity, and my willingness to yield were no longer valid. My mother stood beside me, offering a subtle nod as I moved toward the exit. Her expression conveyed pride, but it was tempered with the awareness that the road ahead would require continued strength. She had spent years watching me navigate the silent expectations of a family dominated by hierarchy and subtle control, and tonight had demonstrated that quiet courage could indeed forge change. Her gaze lingered on mine for a fraction longer than necessary, a silent affirmation of the bond between us, and I felt a deep sense of validation and empowerment as I stepped out into the cool evening air. The world outside the restaurant felt vast, almost expansive. The city's faint hum, distant traffic, footsteps on the sidewalk, occasional laughter from nearby cafes, was a stark contrast to the pressure cooker of the dinner table. I inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs, savoring the freedom of movement, the absence of expectation, the ability to choose my path unencumbered. It was a sensation I hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. The exhilarating clarity of walking away intact, of reclaiming ownership of my life. I felt the subtle adrenaline coursing through me, a quiet energy that contrasted sharply with the tension I had carried for hours. Each step away from the restaurant, each beat of my heart, reinforced the sense that I had made a choice that honored not just my inheritance, but my autonomy. The quiet refusal, which had seemed so small in the heat of the moment, now revealed itself as a profound act of self-respect. I thought of the years spent navigating subtle pressures, the silent expectations, the moments when I had yielded without question. Those memories were now reframed, no longer defining my limits, but highlighting the strength I had cultivated quietly over time. The night had been a catalyst, transforming accumulated experience and resilience into a deliberate act of agency. I understood that walking away intact didn't mean avoiding conflict. It meant facing it and emerging without losing oneself. I paused briefly on the sidewalk, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the path ahead. The city felt alive around me, its pulse steady, welcoming, and almost affirming. I realized that the quiet refusal had not just changed the family dynamic. It had shifted something within me, a fundamental recognition that my voice, my choices, and my autonomy were non-negotiable. For the first time, I felt fully aligned with my sense of self. The evening air carried a faint scent of rain, fresh and cleansing, as if the city itself had acknowledged the transformation that had occurred within me. I walked a few more steps, my senses heightened, aware of every sound, every movement, every subtle shift in the environment. The ordinary world outside contrasted sharply with the extraordinary intensity of the dinner, yet it felt connected, the calm after the storm, the stillness after pressure, the expansive space that one could finally inhabit after asserting boundaries. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the softly lit restaurant, the memory of the table and the confrontation still vivid in my mind. I realized that I wasn't leaving behind tension or expectation. I was carrying forward a new understanding, one that would inform every interaction, every decision, every choice in the future. Walking away intact was not about avoidance. It was about conscious engagement, measured response, and unwavering commitment to self-respect. Sliding into the driver's seat, I felt the familiar comfort of the steering wheel beneath my hands, a tactile reminder of control. I started the engine, the low hum, a grounding rhythm that echoed my own heartbeat. As I drove through quiet streets, I replayed the evening in my mind, noting the subtle victories, the shifts in expression, the small acknowledgments that marked change. Each memory reinforced the sense that I had acted not only with courage but with clarity, and that the night had cemented a deeper understanding of who I was and what I would not compromise. I reflected on the relationships in my life, how they might be reshaped, recalibrated, and tested. Walking away intact was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first step in a long, evolving journey of self-definition, one where expectations could be met without surrendering integrity, where boundaries could be maintained without inciting unnecessary conflict, and where quiet strength could speak louder than any heated argument. By the time I arrived home, the city's lights casting long shadows across familiar streets, I felt a deep, satisfying exhaustion. The night had demanded everything: courage, patience, subtlety, and emotional fortitude. And in meeting that demand, I had discovered something remarkable. Resilience is quiet, resolve is patient, and walking away intact is its own victory. I parked the car, stepped out, and inhaled the familiar scent of my neighborhood, the faint aroma of freshly cut grass, the distant laughter of children, the soft hum of life continuing around me. Each detail reinforced the sense of grounding, of ordinary beauty persisting alongside extraordinary emotional events. I felt whole, despite the intensity of the evening, and a profound sense of liberation settled over me. Stepping through my front door, I finally allowed myself to exhale fully, letting the tension and pressure drain away. I had preserved not only the inheritance, but also my identity, my voice, and my sense of self. The quiet refusal, the deliberate choice to stand firm, had carried me through a night of immense pressure, and now it anchored me in the understanding that integrity is its own reward. As I set down my bag and removed my shoes, I thought about tomorrow, the days ahead, and the subtle but lasting shifts that tonight had introduced into my family and my life. Walking away intact was not the end of challenges. It was the affirmation that I could face them without compromising who I am. The night had been transformative, and I felt ready, steady, and unshakable. As I sat in the quiet of my room later that night, the events of the evening replayed in my mind like a film, each moment etched with clarity I hadn't expected. The tension at the dinner table, the subtle glances, the weight of unspoken expectations. It all seemed both distant and immediate, as if I were standing outside myself watching the scene unfold for the first time. And yet, the emotions, the pressure, the quiet triumphs, all of it was mine. I realized that the true inheritance I had preserved wasn't just material. It was something far more significant: my voice, my boundaries, and the right to assert myself in a world that had long tried to dictate otherwise. The quiet refusal that night had become a declaration, not to anyone else, but to myself. I was worthy of respect, of agency, of standing firm even when every instinct told me to yield. I thought about my father, the man who had spent years carefully managing the rules and expectations around our family. There was pride there, yes, but also disappointment, frustration, and the recognition that his control could no longer be absolute. For the first time, I understood the complexity of his position, not as an excuse, but as context. He had built a system where obedience was rewarded and defiance tested. And yet, tonight, by simply holding my ground, I had shifted that system ever so slightly. I had introduced a new dynamic, one that would ripple through future conversations, future demands, and future moments of quiet coercion. The subtle, almost imperceptible impact of standing firm had changed everything, not through loud confrontation, but through deliberate presence, patience, and unwavering resolve. Marissa would no longer assume she could manipulate or persuade me with ease. The confidence she had carried into the room, the expectation that I would comply, had been shaken. I knew this would alter how she approached me in the future. And while I didn't feel vindictive, I acknowledged a quiet satisfaction in knowing the balance had shifted. Even my mother, who had once tried to mediate between us, now recognized the importance of my autonomy. The small nods, the gentle touches, the unspoken acknowledgement of my courage, they all reinforced that change, while subtle could be profound. And me, I was different, walking away from the dinner intact. From the pressure, the expectation, and the manipulation had taught me something essential. Strength is quiet, courage is deliberate, and boundaries are not concessions. They are declarations of self-worth. I realized that life would continue to test me in ways both big and small, but that night had given me a foundation I had never fully possessed before. The inheritance, the words, the conflict, they had all been a crucible, refining me, clarifying me, and showing me that my integrity and self-respect were my truest assets. Looking out the window at the city lights, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I knew the challenges weren't over, that the subtle pressures of family, expectation, and life itself would return in new forms. But for the first time, I understood that I was equipped to face them, fully aware of my own value, my own voice, and my own capacity to assert myself without apology. That night, that quiet refusal, had done more than preserve what was mine. It had given me a life intact, whole, and ready to be lived on my terms. And in that realization, I finally felt free, empowered, and unshakably myself.